it was an ending indeed. This is Funhouse. We're here to talk about Wheel of Time today, a series I've spent the last 2 years reading. And let me say that I have a lot of very mixed thoughts on this series, but we'll go through them kind of in order. I think overall I was very happy I read it, and it was a lot of dedication because it's a 14 book series. Each book is 800 pages long on average, I think. And it took a long time to get through the series, and there's opportunity cost to that. There's other series I didn't read. There was a while where I wasn't sure I was going to keep going with the series because the first 4 books or so I wasn't really feeling it, and I kept just having enough interest in the series to move on to the next book. Like over and over again, I'd be like, maybe I'll put this down. Well, I'll read a little bit of the next book, and I would pick up the next book, and I would keep going. Once I reached about book 5, I knew I was going to finish the series because I was invested at that point and I needed to see how it was going to end. But there was a while where I was just getting going and there was a lot ahead of me and not much behind me where I was wondering if I was going to actually commit to it. And I'm glad I did because ultimately I really enjoyed this series. It's not one of my favorite of all time, but it was a good time with some bad elements and some really shaky stuff along the way. So let's kind of break this down into the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then I'm going to talk about like specific characters and how I felt about individual characters. And this is going to be a spoiler-filled video, and it's going to be a longer video, so buckle up. Okay, what did I really like about this series? I really liked the character arcs. I thought that this was some of the best realized character work I've ever seen, which is amazing because at the beginning of the series I didn't like the characters much at all. It took me 5-6 books before I really got invested in them. But once I got invested in them and saw that they were on these like really dynamic arcs, I became very invested in them. And by the end of the series, I think the character arcs were some of the best I've ever read. And most Wheel of Time fans, wheelies as they're called in online circles, will agree with this point wholeheartedly. The distance Rand and company travel from the beginning of the series to the end of the series is truly amazing. And so I'm a big fan of the character arcs of the series. I think that that's one of the better aspects of the series. And we'll talk about the characters in more detail a little bit later on. The world building. I love the different cultures. I love the scope of the world. I didn't love the map. The map's a little bland and generic. It's just like a square or a rectangle with, some kingdoms sort of scattered in there. And it took a long time for me to see that the world building was good. I think it first really hit me that they were doing a lot with the world building when the Aiel showed up, and I realized how like dynamic and interesting that culture was. But there's a lot of really interesting cultures and societies in this world that are all different, all thought out, all interesting, and the little details about the cultural differences really make a lot of what works in this series work. And I think even before the character arcs, the world building is what kind of hooked me and kept me carrying on when I wasn't sure I was going to finish the series. The other thing I want to shout out is the last 4 books, starting with Knife of Dreams through Gathering Storm, Tower of Midnight, and Memory of Light. That 4-book run was phenomenal. And a lot of that was Brandon Sanderson, who did a great job ending the series. But Knife of Dreams was great too, one of the better books in the series, and that was, full Robert Jordan. So I kind of like, we'll talk about this a little bit in the bad, but like, and the ugly, but I started not loving the series in the first like 4 books. Books like 5 through 8, I was kind of on board. 9 and 10 really struggled through. That was the heart of the slog. And then 11 through 14 were phenomenal. And I think 14 is one of the best books I've ever read. I think it's one of the best endings I've ever read. I think it's absolutely crazy degree of difficulty. The thing I would compare it to is like Avengers Endgame, just the scope of the final battle that is being pulled off. And it even has a portal scene like Avengers Endgame, which is great. You can kind of maybe see where Avengers Endgame may have gotten that idea. I don't know. But yeah, it's just a great ending to a series that is a very high degree of difficulty because you've got a huge cast of characters who all need their moment to shine in the final battle. The stakes have to feel real. You have to carry it over for 1,000 pages of fighting, which is insane. And then the showdown with Rand and the Dark One had to feel earned, and I think there was very few ways to do that, and I think they found a way that worked, which was to do sort of a more of a intellectual, mental, emotional battle rather than a physical fight, which I think would have, no matter what, felt like a letdown. So yeah, that's what I really liked about the series. What didn't I like as much? The bad. I think one of the things that didn't work about this series is the bad guys were really underwhelming until the final book. And it was a problem I had from day one where I just wasn't invested in the villains. I don't really go for like big dark one, embodiment of evil caricature villains as much as some people in the fantasy genre do. I like my Game of Thrones villains, like your Joffreys or your Tywin Lannisters, who are like grounded in human traits and emotions. And this book didn't have much of that. The Forsaken sort of introduced that for a bit, but they ended up being kind of incompetent and useless for most of the series until the last book, when they actually showed up and showed why they were considered the Forsaken. But for most of the series, like, a Forsaken would show up, Rand would just ice them, and then we'd move on. And they never felt threatening or, realistic or interesting in any particular way on an individual basis. And it was one of those things where the book keeps telling you, oh, the Forsaken are very threatening, the Black Aja are very threatening, and then they weren't. And the more threatening, interesting villains were the Seanchin, for example, who were threatening for the entire course of the series and felt like a better set of villains than the Dark One and his armies. Same thing with like Trollocs and Fades. These are just generic cannon fodder villains. They were supposed to be scary and like harder to beat than other humans, but then they, by the end of the series, they had just slaughtered millions of them, and they never felt that threatening. Another bad thing about the series, I think, this is being controversial to be sure, but the first book is very derivative of Lord of the Rings in a way that really detracted from my reading experience. I understand why it was that way, both creatively and for publishing reasons. I just think that was a weakness, and that's ground has been well tilled, so I don't have anything unique to add to it. But I do think that is part of why the early books didn't work for me as well. Is it took me a while to really feel like we were getting off Tolkien's soil. The other thing that worked in some places but largely didn't work was the approach to gender politics in this series. Basically, if you haven't read it, you shouldn't be watching this video. But if you have read it, you know that a big part of the series is the constant clashing between men and women. Men who are like physically stronger, women who have access, the power. Some women have access to magic in a way that men, for the first half of the series, don't, and then eventually men get access to magic too, but it makes them go crazy. We all know this. I found the constant bickering between men and women really tiresome and exhausting, where like they couldn't get along for most of the series. I think towards the end, the writers, both Jordan and Sanderson, got away from that a little bit and started finding some like common ground and harmony between men and women. And there wasn't just a like every other page somebody being like, I just don't understand men, I just don't understand women, inner dialogue going on. I appreciate what Jordan was going for, trying to build a more gender balanced society and and I do appreciate that there's a lot of very strong female characters in the series, which, for the time he was writing, is actually pretty impressive. And I'm glad he went for it. And I think some of it works. I just think that a lot of it is like bound in these like very tired, like old school men are from Mars, women are from Venus, we can't get along sort of tropes. And that was a little unfortunate to me, and that was something I had to slog through a little bit. Okay, let's get to the ugly. This series had so much description of literally everything that there was long stretches of, chapters where I'll admit I skimmed a lot of this series, because you see 3 pages of text with no dialogue, and it would just be like, oh, we're going to learn a lot about this boat. We're going to learn a lot about everybody's dresses. We're going to learn a lot about the furniture in the room. We're going to, like, some of that's good, but I don't need as much of it as this series offers. So that was, the prose was a real challenge for me for most of this series. There was also like these repetitive turns of phrase that everybody knows about, braids being tugged, arms being folded under breasts, etc., that just show up over and over and over and over again. The worst trope in this book that I'm so glad they got away from in the last few books is the constant spankings. These are adults. I don't know why they're spanking each other all the time. Just never ending spankings. It really, really, more than anything else, took me out of the series. And then, of course, the slog. I won't mince words. I think Crossroads of Twilight is one of the worst books I've ever read. And the rebound from Crossroads of Twilight to Knife of Dreams is nothing short of incredible. This series has one of the best books I've ever read in Memory of Light and one of the worst books I've ever read in Crossroads of Twilight. And that just sort of like exemplifies my experience reading The Wheel of Time, in that it had very high highs and very low lows. Okay, those are almost the same height. It's hard to do this in frame. You see what I'm saying. Don't need visual aids for that. So that's the good, the bad, the ugly of The Wheel of Time, and what I liked, didn't like, and really didn't like about the series. What do I think about some of the characters? I think Rand started out as some people have dubbed him, Rand the Bland, a very boring character in the early books, who became one of the most interesting fantasy characters I've ever read. I thought his arc was incredible. I thought everything with him struggling to keep his sanity when he was using the tainted magic was beautifully written and really interesting and really compelling. I thought it was a really good idea by Jordan to make Rand not always on the page. Like he's actually a fairly absent protagonist in much of the series. There's a lot of books where he's operating in the background and we're watching other people reacting to things he's doing more than watching him doing things. And I thought that really worked. I thought it was an interesting twist on a protagonist, on a chosen one arc. This is the chosen one arc done very well. And I think it was a little bit of like the Shark and Jaws effect, where like less was more with Rand, and that really, really helped make him a fascinating, interesting character. I was always excited to hit a Rand chapter, but part of it was because there was so much space between them for so long. For a moment, I really thought that they were going to make Rand go evil in Gathering Storm and like have him join the Dark One or something. And I thought that was going to be an awesome twist and a great arc, and quickly realized it's not that type of series and they were never actually going to do that. But it really felt like it was driving that way for a long time in like books 9, 10, 11, and 12. He took that really hard turn to like chilled out, mellow Rand, and was like, okay, yeah, so Rand is going to be the good guy at the end. That's fine. Funnily enough, I guess because I was reading too fast, trying to wrap it up because I was just like turning pages at the end of the book, I totally missed that business with the pipe until I watched everybody freak out about it on YouTube when I was watching like other people's recap videos. And I was like, wait, what happened with the pipe? And I went back and was like, oh yeah, the pipe. Okay. So I'm not the most attentive reader sometimes. Bear with me with that. Totally glossed over the pipe thing. My theory on the pipe is that he, through like fighting off the Dark One and sealing things, sort of blended the world of dreams into the real world. In the world of dreams, you can make things happen just by thinking it. I think that's something funny's going on there. That's my theory. Obviously, Sanderson himself says he doesn't know what's going on with the pipe, so, I'm not going to be right about that. It's just another interpretation. Probably already out there. I haven't read that deeply into pipe theories. So that's Rand. Perrin. This is going to be controversial. I don't like Perrin. I never liked Perrin. I think part of why the first 4 books didn't work for me is they're very Perrin heavy, and I didn't care for Perrin. Especially book 4, which is a lot of people's favorite book, and just didn't work for me at all. But that was because it was so much. It was Perrin's book. That was when he was doing all of the Two Rivers stuff. And Three Rivers is a town in Michigan that was near where I grew up. Two Rivers is the town in the book. So it was when he's doing all the Two Rivers stuff, and it was fine. It wasn't incredible to me. It was definitely the best Perrin stuff in the book, or in the series. And then he spends most of the rest of the series just pining over his wife, and that relationship really didn't work for me. So yeah, Perrin, not my favorite character. I didn't really get all the Slayer stuff. I found that pretty tedious. All the Wolfstream stuff I found pretty tedious. So just not my favorite character. Matt took a long time to grow on me, but eventually grew on me. I think it took me longer with Matt than most people, but he's a lot of fun. He's just an entertaining, goofy character who, scoundrel with a heart of gold sort of character, and that archetype almost always works. Egwene, this will also be controversial. I like Egwene. I liked Egwene a lot. She was one of my favorite characters in the series, and I think a lot of people don't like Egwene. From what I've seen online, there's a lot of anti-Egwene sentiment out there. I think she's great. I think her arc is great. I think some people are. I've heard her called like a Mary Sue character, which I don't think makes sense to me. Any more than any of these are Mary Sue characters, right? Like, and people are like, well, the difference is she's not Ta'Veren, and I don't, Ta'Veren is like a fantasy nonsense explanation for putting peasant people in places of royalty. I think that Egwene is either honorary Ta'Veren or has knockoff Ta'Veren effects if you care about that sort of thing. But other than that, I think her arc makes sense because what they were looking for at that time were two things in an Amerlin, the rebel Aes Sedai. They wanted a puppet that they could control, so they wanted somebody young and inexperienced and naive, which they thought Egwene was, and she wasn't. Well, she was young and inexperienced, but she wasn't naive. She ended up being very good at her job. And then they wanted somebody who was close to the Dragon Reborn because they wanted to control him. And that turned out to not work very well, but like you could see the logic from the Aes Sedai's perspective, where a lot of people were like, "Why did she get promoted as such a young Aes Sedai?" It's because they wanted a puppet with a connection to the Dragon Reborn. So it made total sense why they would put Egwene in, and I think they even explained it that way at some point in the book, why they put Egwene in those shoes, and then she just took that and ran with it because she's a badass character, and I don't get the Mary Sue allegations at all. Nobody says that about. So my next character to talk about is Nynaeve, who's also great. I didn't like her for most of the first half of the series, and then eventually she really won me over, which I think is a lot of people's arc with Nynaeve. Nobody has Mary Sue allegations about Nynaeve, even though Nynaeve is like the most powerful Aes Sedai, and she's not Ta'Veren. So why isn't that a Mary Sue complaint, right? Like, anytime people talk about Mary Sue's, it really gets on my nerves because it's never applied consistently across characters. It's just that you pick one character you don't like and say that one got too powerful too fast, ignoring Rand, Perrin, Matt, Nynaeve, everybody else who also are overpowered characters for very little explanation, who all happen to come from the same village, right? Like the whole conceit of this is a little weird to begin with. So in my mind, if you need a magical explanation, Egwene and Nynaeve are honorary Ta'Veren. If you don't need a magical explanation, which I don't, it just, there happen to be 5 talented people from the same village, like sometimes a bunch of famous people all went to the same high school. It happens. Their connections and their, matter to each other as well, right? Like one person comes up and brings other people with them, so through association. So I think that explains a lot of it. Nynaeve has a great character arc. She's from her anger issues in the early books, which made her like nigh on unreadable at times because she was so angry all the time, to coming into her own as like a very confident person and just a badass in the later books was great. I do think she was a little wasted in the last battle. I agree with some of those complaints that I've read or listened to or watched. She did heal Alana, which I think Alana was the name of the other Aes Sedai who bonded Rand, that was a disappointing plot line. Like they really built that up that like it was a big deal that Alana bonded Rand, and then it was just used as like a little like temperature raiser in the final scene, and it gave Nynaeve something to do rather than just stand there. She had to use her magical, incredible healing powers to deal with that situation. But that felt like a sort of like lost thread. Like they made this decision and didn't know what to do with it. very rare for this series because most things in this series feel like they were planned from book one, and there are very few loose threads in the Wheel of Time that I've seen, at least in the main cast. But yeah, Nynaeve's great. Elaine, another controversial opinion. I like Elaine. I think sometimes she isn't given the right things to do, and what she's doing is a little like a lot of the Camelin quest for the crown stuff was a little exhausting. But I liked that. I liked Elaine. I thought she was like a good, strong character, a good addition to the mix, and when she was given cool stuff to do, like in the final book, she was great. When she was given sort of like less interesting things to do, her chapters were less interesting. She did have a problem of constantly throwing herself into the thick of danger in ways that were really, reckless. And like I was definitely on Birgitte's side of like, you need to slow down. The prophecy isn't going to save you if you constantly do suicidal things. But overall, I liked her as a character. Moraine, what can you say about Moraine? Great Gandalf figure, cool wizard. It was great to have her. Her death scene was great. I almost wish she stayed dead because she didn't really add much to the final book. Again, she was just kind of there for Rand's final confrontation. You could have swapped. I mean, you could have swapped Alana into that spot, had her get hurt, had Nynaeve heal Alana, and have that all feel relevant rather than just like we need a big name, so we put Moraine in the final confrontation, right? Like, I don't. But I also loved the scene of resurrecting her and going to the towers of the whatever the tower was called, Towers of Genji, and the showdown with the snakes and foxes and Mat was amazing. So, I'm not like too beefed about it, but I don't know that Moraine needed to be brought back, but it wasn't like the worst thing in the world that she was. Lan, I'm not as high on Lan as everybody else. I think Lan is cool. I think he got his moment in the last book, which was awesome. I think he probably should have died in that moment, but then that would have screwed up Nynaeve when they needed her to like seal the bore. So like that probably didn't actually work to have him die there. But he had a great moment, and he was around. I think the biggest problem with Lan is like he's sort of like generic swordsman, and he's just kind of around for most of the series. He doesn't do a lot, so he never like got into my like inner circle of like favorite characters. Loyal did. Loyal is one of my favorites. I love Loyal. I wish there was more of him. I wish he was in every book all the time. He's so delightful. I don't have much to say about him except he's just a delight. Galad and Gawain, I don't care about. I didn't like either of them. They both bored me, and I didn't care about their arcs. Avienda, I loved. She was great. I could have used even more of her. We'll kind of do these a little more rapid fire as we get into some of the supporting main cast, if you will. Same with Min. Like I was never disappointed to see Min on the screen or on the page. Min is a great character. Really, really cool. I have not dove into like a breakdown of her visions or anything like that to be like, oh, I missed all this foreshadowing. She's just a really cool character and very well written, and I really liked her. Same with Birgitte. I think Birgitte's one of my favorite characters of the side characters, like the main side characters. Fail, I did not like. Fail drove me crazy for the entire series, and the less said, the better. And then Tom. Tom's delightful. You got to have a bard in a fantasy series. A good bard is always a positive addition to the mix. So yeah, that's my final thoughts on Wheel of Time. I thought I'd talk a little bit longer than this, but that's sort of what I have to say about it. It's a really good series. It's not one of my all-time favorites. It's got its problems, but the things it does well, it does really well, and I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad I went on this journey for 2 years, chugging my way through the Wheel of Time. So those are my final thoughts. Thanks for listening. And this review is brought to you by me. I wrote a book. It's called The Quantum Entanglement. It's a sci-fi dystopian novel. It's great, I think. Everybody who I've talked to really likes it. You can check it out on Amazon. You can see the link in the description below. So I am sponsoring my own video. Buy my book. Thanks for watching. We'll have more book and movie content in the future.